Hi guys. So as most of you know, I took a training on resiliency a few weeks ago. It's called the Community Resiliency Model, and it was put out by the Trauma Resource Institute. I have this little book here. So today what I wanted to do is just teach you a little bit about what I learned at my training. Because this is a public health model and we want to be able to share it with as many people as possible due to the fact that we all have nervous systems. We'll learn a little bit about that in a minute. And we all can use a set of strategies to help us bounce back from stress or adversity and to be more resilient in the face of challenge. So as I said, the model is called CRM, Community Resiliency Model, CRM. And the first main concept of CRM that I wanted to teach you guys about is called the resilience zone. So I'm going to show you this little graphic. So what the resilience zone is a state of wellness of your body, mind, and spirit. It's kind of like when you're feeling like your best self. So you can handle the ups and downs of life. You can see on this diagram throughout the day your moods might go up, your energy levels might go up or down, but you feel like you can handle everything. You don't feel like you're going to lose your cool, flip your lid, as we say in some of the approaches that I teach. So our resilient zone is where we're able to do our best learning and our best thinking. We can problem solve. We can do all of the things that we need to do in our day-to-day life. So we really want to be in this zone as often as possible. But sometimes there will be traumatic or stressful events, we call them triggers sometimes, that will strike. And that would be like this red lightning bolt. I'm sure you can relate to some of these that have happened in your life. But what can happen is rather than staying in our resilient zone, which would be between the dotted lines here, we can get bumped out. And we can get bumped into one of two places. So we can get bumped up into our high zone, which would leave us feeling things like edgy, irritable, angry. I kind of think of it like our engine is running too fast. Excuse me. Sometimes you might feel pain, be hypervigilant, or you can get bumped into your low zone. And I think of that as having your engine stuck in slow motion. So you might be bored, depressed, numb, sad, wanting to disconnect and isolate from other people. Should have put some water out here. I got a little tickle, sorry. Anyway, what the CRM skills that I'm going to teach you in a minute help you to do is to stay in your resilient zone more often. And remember, our best learning and our best thinking happen when we're in our resilient zone. And they also help us to widen or deepen our resilient zone, so we can't get bumped into the high or low zone as easily. And finally, they help us to recognize when we're starting to approach the edge of our resilient zone, and we learn some tools to help us stay within the zone rather than bouncing out. So I'd like to teach you the skills, the CRM skills, that help us to do that, to stay in our zone or to bounce back more quickly. And the first of those is called tracking. I don't actually have a picture for it, but I'm just going to keep out my notes to make sure I don't forget to tell you anything about tracking. So tracking is just when we pay attention to what's happening inside of our body. I like to think of it as kind of the internal GPS of our nervous system. So we learn to pay attention to what's happening on the inside. And we want to pay particular attention to those feelings that are pleasant or neutral. And we want to try to draw our attention away from those feelings that are unpleasant, distressing, sort of negative. And I like to think about our palm when we talk about the CRM skills. So at the center is tracking. And this is the heart of all of the CRM skills that we'll teach you today. When you learn the other 5 skills, they'll always come back to tracking. So I'll teach you a skill and I'll ask you, notice what's happening on your body. Pay attention to what's happening on the inside. And remember, we're going to focus on those sensations that are more pleasant or neutral. So, the best way to learn tracking is through our next skill, which is called resourcing. And resourcing is when we bring to mind something that gives us a feeling of strength, joy, or peace. So there can be external resources. Perhaps you have a pet, a person, a place that you like to call to mind that gives you that sense of joy, peace, or strength. Or we can have internal resources. Those can be things like memories, a spiritual belief that you have, an affirmation that you say, maybe some of your own personal qualities that you value. So I'll just share two of my resources to give you guys some examples. So most of you know I have a dog, Brody, and he's one of my external resources. So when I find myself getting really stressed, I call to mind Brody, and he just brings me a feeling of joy, of peace, and helps me to kind of stay in my zone. And then an internal resource, in Finland, where my dad is from, there's a word called sisu, which means resilience. And I just try to draw on that resiliency and remember that I have that, and that's something that I can call to mind as a reminder of my strength. So we've got tracking, which is paying attention to what's happening on the inside of the body, remembering that we want to focus on those sensations that are more positive or neutral. And now we've learned resourcing, which is when we bring to mind something that gives us a feeling of peace, joy, or strength. And we can have internal or external resources. So what I'd like you to do now is bring to mind a resource that you might have. I'll give you a minute to think of what that might be. Again, it can be a memory, it can be a spiritual belief, it can be a person, a place. So take a minute to call to mind a resource, internal or external, and just start thinking about that resource. Think about some of the details of that resource. Think about what you really like about that resource. If it's a person, perhaps what you do with them or how they make you feel. And as you're thinking of that resource in your mind, I want you to start to notice what's happening inside your body. And this is the tracking. So when I think of Brody, for example, I notice that I get sort of a warm feeling across my heart, sort of a light, expansive feeling as well in my chest. If you're not sure what's happening in your body when you bring your resource to mind, you might want to think about what happens to your muscles. Oftentimes they relax or get a bit looser. You might notice what happens to your heart rate, to your breathing. But remember, we're tracking specifically those sensations that are more positive, pleasant, or neutral, because that helps us to bounce back to our zone or to stay in our zone better. So focus on pleasant or neutral sensations, excuse me. And I also want to point out that we're not focusing on feeling words like happy, excited. We're focusing on physical sensations. So you noticed when I talked about Brody, I talked about this warm, expansive feeling in my chest. I do notice that my breathing often deepens when I think about one of my resources, and usually if I pay attention to it, my heart rate slows down, muscles loosen. So take a minute to think of your resource, whether it's internal or external, and just notice what's happening on the inside of your body. I'm going to take a minute to do the same with mine. Sometimes it might help to close your eyes, although that's certainly not required. So just take a minute and track into your body as you imagine your resource. Now for the purposes of this training, we're not going to do as much sitting with that as I typically would in person. But I do encourage you to practice this, because what I teach in the longer training is that the brain has these neural pathways that get stronger with use. Growth mindset, neuroplasticity, some of you know about these concepts. And we have to use these skills to get them to be stronger. We have to strengthen those neural pathways. So if that didn't feel normal or it just felt a little clunky, know that it will get easier with practice, and you can call that resource to mind anytime and pay attention to what's happening in your body. If you have one of the handbooks, and it's also in my PowerPoint, there's a great list of sensation words, because a lot of times we get stuck on feeling words, happy, relaxed, excited. So I'm not sure if this will show up. But you want to think about your 5 senses when you're thinking of sensory words. So instead of I'm feeling happy, I'm feeling, a soft, warm feeling in my body. Touch is one that I tend to relate well to. You can pay attention to the temperature that you notice in your body. So that's just a tip for resourcing. So just to recap, we've learned tracking, our first skill, paying attention to the sensations that are happening inside our body, focusing on those that are more pleasant or neutral. We just learned resourcing, bringing to mind a person, place, feeling, or idea that gives us a sense of strength, joy, or peace. And now I'm going to teach you the next skill, which is grounding. And grounding is just teaching your body to be fully present in the moment. So a lot of times we get stuck worrying about what's going to come in the future. I call that planning. Or we get stuck focusing on what happened in the past, and that could be, regretting, just looking backwards. And the best thing we can do for our nervous system, and I believe our lives, is to be present in the current moment. And what grounding teaches us to do is to be fully present. But we do that by paying attention to where our body is making support or making contact with the things that support it. So it could be a chair that we're grounding on, and we pay attention to where our body is making contact with the chair. It could be that we're laying down in our bed, and we pay attention to all the places that our body is making contact with that bed. You can ground on a wall. I learned at my training that you can even ground in water because it's making contact with your body, and some people prefer that as a means of grounding. So I would like to just do a really quick grounding exercise for you that kind of helps you get a sense of what this skill is like. So I invite you to get in a comfortable position. You can close your eyes if that feels good or not, your choice. Take your time, just getting comfortable. Notice how your back is making contact with the chair, the sofa, the floor, the wall, the earth, wherever you may happen to be. If you're sitting, bring your attention to your seat, making contact with the sofa, the chair, the ground. Now notice your thighs, your legs, and then your feet. Bring awareness to your feet, making contact with the ground. Notice the sensations that are more pleasant or neutral to you within your body. If you start to become aware of uncomfortable sensations, simply bring your attention back to those places that feel comfortable or even neutral. And as we get ready to end, you'll slowly scan your body, bringing your attention to all the sensations that are pleasant or neutral. So that's grounding. And if you do any yoga like I do, a lot of times they'll spend time at the beginning and even end of the class doing some grounding to get you to come into your body. Which reminds me, I did want to show you guys the triune brain hand model real quickly. Some of you already know this, but this helps you understand why the sensation is so important and why we don't want to get into describing emotions or feelings. So we are going to use our palm to represent our brain, and this is a really simplistic model of the brain. So for those of you that study like neuroscience, this is probably going to be a little bit insulting how simple it is, but it helps us to get what's going on. So this part down here is our brainstem, and this is the part of your body that just controls your unconscious actions in your body. So things like breathing, circulation, reproduction, reflexes, all of these things happen in the brainstem. And then as we come up, the palm is your limbic system and your thumb is your amygdala. And this is like the emotional center of the body. So the amygdala is like the fire alarm that signals fight, flight, or freeze. And in this part of the brain, a lot of past memories are stored, and they can be triggered in the present, and that can sometimes make you feel like that past circumstance is occurring right now. You can have all of the symptoms even though it's not. So we'll talk more about that in my longer training, but again, this is brainstem. Unconscious body responses like breathing, circulation, reproduction. And then we call this the emotional brain or the limbic system, and it's got that amygdala, which is our fight or flight fire alarm. So the most important part for your day-to-day, like working and problem solving and relationships, I believe, to be effective, is this top part, which is the cortex. And the cortex is your thinking brain. So this lets you do problem solving, higher level thinking, just be rational as you engage in your relationships. But what happens is when we get super stressed or bumped out of our zone, as we learned earlier, you can flip your lid and that cortex goes offline. And so now the emotional brain and the reflexive or survival brain are running the show. And they don't speak the language of words. And this is what CRM taps into. They speak the language of sensation.